The man no one saw coming. The morning rush at Falcon Tech Industries was in full swing. Employees bustled through the sleek glass doors, coffee cups in hand, their eyes glued to screens or locked in hurried conversations. No one paid much attention to the man in the wheelchair rolling into the lobby. Dressed in a sharp blue suit, his expression unreadable, he observed everything. The hurried glances, the dismissive looks, the way people brushed past him as if he were invisible. Robert King had expected this. In fact, he had counted on it. As the new CEO of Falcon Tech, Robert had no intention of making a grand entrance. He wasn't here for applause or admiration. He wanted to see the company for what it really was, beneath the polished branding, beyond the rehearsed smiles. So, instead of taking the executive elevator, instead of announcing his arrival, he rolled into his own company unnoticed, watching, waiting. It didn't take long for reality to reveal itself. A woman, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, strode toward him with the confidence of someone who owned the space. Her narrowed eyes locked onto him, her lips curling in displeasure. Susan, the HR manager. She stopped in front of him, arms crossed. "Excuse me," she said, her tone laced with irritation. "This area is for employees only. I can help you find the exit." Robert met her gaze, his expression giving nothing away. He had seen what he needed to see. But Susan had no idea that her career was about to be unraveled in front of the entire office. The room seemed to shrink as Susan's words lingered in the air. A few employees nearby stole glances, curious about the exchange but unwilling to interfere. Robert, still composed, tilted his head slightly. "I appreciate the offer," he said calmly, his voice carrying an air of quiet authority. "But I'm exactly where I need to be." Susan scoffed. "I doubt that." She eyed his wheelchair, then the expensive fabric of his suit. "Unless you have an appointment, I suggest you leave before security gets involved." Before Robert could respond, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Susan, what are you doing?" Emma, the regional manager, was rushing toward them, her face pale. Unlike Susan, she had been briefed on the CEO's unconventional plan, and she immediately realized what was happening. Susan had just made a catastrophic mistake. "What does it look like?" Susan said, irritated. "I'm dealing with someone who doesn't belong here." Emma's breath hitched. She turned to Robert, swallowing hard. "Sir, Robert raised a hand, silencing her gently. Then, turning back to Susan, he let the moment stretch, watching realization flicker across her face. A storm was coming, and Susan was at the center of it. A ripple of silence spread through the office as employees sensed something was wrong. "Sir?" Susan's face twisted in confusion at Emma's panicked tone. Her confidence faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered, shaking her head in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "I'm handling this." Emma hesitated, looking between Susan and Robert. She knew what was about to happen, and part of her wanted to step in, to save Susan from herself. But there was no stopping this. Robert had orchestrated this moment, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. "Susan," Emma said slowly, her voice heavy with urgency. "That's Robert King. He's the new CEO." The words landed like a thunderclap. Susan blinked, then let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "That's not funny." But no one was laughing. She turned to Robert, expecting him to correct Emma, to shake his head and put an end to this ridiculous claim. Instead, he simply watched her, his steady gaze giving her no lifeline. Realization hit Susan like a punch to the gut. The air around her grew impossibly heavy. She had just dismissed the most powerful man in the company. The room buzzed with hushed whispers as Susan's world crumbled in real time. Employees who had once feared her now exchanged glances, their eyes filled with a mix of shock and quiet satisfaction. Robert took his time before speaking. His voice, calm but edged with authority, cut through the tension like a scalpel. "It's interesting," he said, folding his hands in his lap, "how people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching." Susan opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to salvage whatever was left. But what could she say? There was no excuse for what she had done. No words that could erase the arrogance, the dismissal, the assumption that he was beneath her. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert nodded slowly. You didn't, he agreed. But that's the problem, isn't it? Susan swallowed hard. The weight of his words settled over her like a crushing force. Around them, employees watched in stunned silence. No one had ever dared to challenge Susan before. But now, her power was slipping away, one excruciating second at a time. The office remained eerily silent, the usual hum of phones and keyboards now replaced with unspoken tension. Susan had built her authority on fear. For years, employees had learned to avoid her gaze, to nod in agreement, to keep their heads down. But now, the woman who had ruled the office when iron grip stood frozen, her confidence unraveling with every passing second. Robert leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair, his presence more commanding than anyone standing in the room. You judged me the moment you saw me, he continued, his voice steady. And I have to wonder, how many others have you treated the same way? Susan's hands twitched at her sides. You didn't mean to get caught, Robert interrupted, his eyes locking onto hers. That's different from not meaning to judge. A murmur spread through the crowd. Employees exchanged knowing glances. Susan's behavior wasn't new. She had dismissed, belittled, and intimidated people for years. The only difference today was that her victim had the power to do something about it. For the first time, Susan felt the weight of the fear she had instilled in others, and it terrified her. Susan's mind raced for a way out, a way to fix this. But how do you undo years of arrogance in a single moment? Robert, meanwhile, remained composed. He wasn't interested in empty apologies or excuses. He was interested in the truth. Tell me, Susan, he said, his voice deceptively calm. If I were just a client in a wheelchair, would you have treated me differently? Susan hesitated. The answer was obvious. Yes, of course, she would have. But saying aloud would only tighten the noose around her neck. She swallowed. I was just trying to maintain professionalism. Robert let out a quiet chuckle. Professionalism? He gestured toward the employees, still watching the scene unfold. Tell me, does anyone here believe that's what just happened? Silence. Susan's gaze darted around the room, but no one came to her defense. She had spent years alienating herself. And now, in her moment of reckoning, she stood completely alone. For the first time, she understood what true powerlessness felt like. The weight of Robert's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Employees who had once feared Susan now looked at her with something else. Satisfaction, maybe even relief. For years, she had ruled through intimidation, and no one had dared to speak against her. But today was different. Today, the silence wasn't compliance. It was judgment. Robert shifted slightly in his wheelchair, his gaze sweeping across the room. It's not just about one person, he said, his voice carrying across the office. Toxic cultures don't survive because of one individual. They survive because good people stay silent. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some employees lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact. Others exchanged uneasy glances. They had all seen Susan's behavior before, but no one had spoken up. Emma, the regional manager, took a deep breath and stepped forward. We all knew this was a problem, she admitted. We didn't think anything would change. Robert nodded. And that's exactly how workplaces become broken. He turned his attention back to Susan. Fear only works for so long before it turns into resentment. Susan's face was pale. For the first time, she saw it, the truth she had ignored for years. She had been feared, but never respected. And now, she had nothing left. Susan's hands trembled at her sides. Her entire career had been built on control. But in one moment, she had lost it all. Robert exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. I believe in second chances, he said, his voice calm but firm. But only for those who truly understand why they need one. Susan flinched. The unspoken words hit harder than any formal punishment. Emma glanced at Robert, then at the employees, then back to Susan. I think we all know what needs to happen, she said carefully. Susan's heart pounded. Wait, she said, her voice cracking. Robert held up a hand, cutting her off. If you were in my position, he said, tilting his head slightly, would you give yourself another chance? Silence. Susan swallowed hard. The realization was crushing. No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. And with that single word, her fate was sealed. A hush fell over the office as Susan's whispered admission lingered in the air. The weight of her own words settled on her shoulders like a crushing force. She had spent years ruling with an iron fist, making quick and often ruthless decisions about employees' futures. Now, for the first time, she was on the receiving end. Robert remained silent for a moment, giving her space to let the reality sink in. Then, his voice cut through the tension like a blade. You're right, he said simply. You wouldn't give yourself a second chance. And neither will I. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. Susan's face went ghostly pale. Emma stepped forward, clearing her throat. Effective immediately, Susan. You are relieved of your position. The words hit her like a slap. She staggered slightly, her nails digging into her palms. But This is not up for debate, Robert said. Toxic leadership has no place at Falcon Tech. A heavy silence filled the room. Then one clap. Then another. Applause erupted, not in cruelty, but in relief. For years, Susan had wielded power through fear. And today, that power had been stripped away. As Susan gathered her things in silence, a strange energy filled the office. Employees who had once cowered now stood taller, their gazes lifted in cautious optimism. Something had shifted. Emma turned to Robert. What happens now? She asked. Robert surveyed the room, his sharp eyes studying the faces before him. This wasn't just about removing one bad leader. It was about setting a new standard. We rebuild, he said, but not from the top down. From the inside out. A ripple of interest passed through the crowd. Employees had been waiting for change for a long time. Now it was finally here. Starting today, Robert continued, we focus on the people, not just the profits. We create a workplace where respect isn't just a slogan, it's a reality. Murmurs of agreement spread through the team. For the first time in years, hope replaced hesitation. As Susan walked out for the last time, she wasn't just leaving a company. She was leaving behind the old ways that had held Falcon Tech back for far too long. The office, once a space of silent tension, now buzzed with an energy that felt foreign yet refreshing. Employees exchanged glances, some hesitant, others cautiously optimistic. Change was coming, but could they trust it? Emma took a deep breath, stepping into her new role with measured confidence. She turned to Robert. People are relieved that Susan is gone, but they're also nervous. What's next? Robert's sharp gaze swept over the room. We start with trust, he said. No more fear, no more intimidation. But that means we need to have an honest conversation. He wheeled himself toward the open floor, inviting employees to gather. A few hesitant at first, then more stepped forward. This company has incredible talent, Robert began. But for too long, voices have been silenced. That ends today. I want to hear what's working and what's broken. A murmur ran through the group. For years, speaking up had been a risk. Now, their CEO was asking for it. Carlos, a quiet but sharp-minded engineer, raised his hand. I love working here, but I don't feel valued. Heads nodded. Robert leaned forward. Tell me more. For the first time, Falcon Tech employees weren't afraid to speak. As employees hesitantly opened up, Robert listened intently, his expression unreadable. The truth was hard to hear, but necessary. I was once passed over for a promotion because Susan said I wasn't assertive enough, Mia, a marketing specialist, revealed. But I wasn't allowed to be assertive. Not under her. She threatened to fire me for taking a sick day, added Mark, a software developer. I came in with the flu because I couldn't afford to lose my job. Each story painted a clear picture, one of a workplace that had functioned under fear, not leadership. Robert exhaled. You shouldn't have had to deal with that. His voice was steady, but his hands tightened slightly on the armrest of his wheelchair. Emma took a step forward. And we won't let it continue. A pause. Then Robert nodded. This company's success has always come from its people. Starting today, we rebuild trust. And that means real change, not just words. Mia crossed her arms. No offense, Mr. King, but we've heard promises before. Robert smiled slightly. Then it's time for actions to speak louder than words. The room fell into a heavy silence. Employees had heard plenty of promises before, but they had learned the hard way that words meant nothing without action. Robert King knew this. He wasn't just here to make a speech. He was here to prove himself. You're right to be skeptical, he admitted, his gaze steady. That's why I won't ask for trust. I'll earn it. Emma stepped beside him. We're starting with immediate changes. First, HR is being restructured to actually support employees, not intimidate them. A few employees exchanged glances, surprised at the direct approach. Robert continued. Second, any manager who has abused their position will be held accountable. If you've been mistreated, my door is open. A murmur spread through the group. For years, complaints had been buried. Now, they had a voice. Mark hesitated before speaking. And what about people like Susan? Will she just be replaced by another version of herself? Robert's expression darkened slightly. No, leadership will be based on integrity, not arrogance. And that starts with accountability, including my own. The weight of his words settled over them. For the first time, change felt real. The meeting ended, but the real work was just beginning. Employees returned to their desks, cautiously hopeful but still watching. Would Robert follow through? Emma found him in his temporary office, reviewing files. That was a bold speech, she said, leaning against the doorframe. Robert glanced up. It wasn't a speech. It was a commitment. Emma smiled slightly. Good, because some people are still waiting for proof. Just then, Mia knocked. Mr. King, I need to talk to you. Robert gestured for her to sit. What's on your mind? Mia hesitated, then took a deep breath. There's a manager in my department, Brad. He's just as bad as Susan. He plays favorites, dismisses complaints, and takes credit for other people's work. Robert's expression didn't change. Do others feel the same? Mia nodded. But no one says anything because he's untouchable. Emma folded her arms. Not anymore. Robert nodded. Tell everyone. If they've been wronged, they need to come forward. Brad is about to learn the same lesson Susan did. Change wasn't just coming, it was happening. Word spread quickly. For the first time, employees dared to believe that justice was possible. Brad, the senior manager of marketing, had ruled his department through fear. He played favorites, dismissed concerns, and took credit for work that wasn't his. Now, his name was being whispered in the hallways, and the weight of his actions was catching up to him. Robert sat in his office, reviewing complaints that had been buried for years. Emma, standing beside him, shook her head. It's worse than I thought. Mia sat across from them, her hands clenched. We can't just let him get away with it. Robert met her gaze. We won't. He pressed a button on his phone. Send Brad in. Minutes later, Brad strolled into the office, still wearing his smug confidence. What's this about? He asked, feigning innocence. Robert didn't waste time. We have reports of intimidation, credit stealing, and blatant favoritism under your leadership. Care to explain? Brad scoffed. Who's complaining? A few underperformers. Emma's eyes narrowed. No, Brad. Your entire team. Brad's smirk faltered. For the first time, he realized his power was slipping. Brad sat up straighter, his tone shifting from arrogance to damage control. Look, I push my team hard because that's what gets results. Robert remained calm but unwavering. Leadership isn't about control. It's about empowerment. He leaned forward. Tell me, Brad, how many projects have you taken credit for? Brad's jaw tightened. That's ridiculous. Emma slid a folder across the table. This is a report detailing employees' contributions over the past year. Your name appears frequently in places it shouldn't. Brad paled slightly, but he forced a laugh. Come on, this is business. Everyone does it. Robert's voice turned steely. Not here. A long silence stretched between them before Robert spoke again. Your leadership is built on fear, manipulation, and deceit. That ends the day. Brad shifted uncomfortably. So what? You're firing me? Robert studied him for a moment. You can either step down quietly, or I can publicly expose everything you've done. Either way, your time here is over. Brad swallowed hard, realizing he had no escape. For the first time, true accountability had arrived at Falcon Tech. Brad sat frozen, his mind scrambling for a way out. He had spent years manipulating his way to power, and now, in a single conversation, it was crumbling. You can't do this, he muttered, his confidence cracking. Robert raised an eyebrow. I already have. Emma slid a resignation letter toward him. Sign it, and you leave quietly. Refuse, and we take this to the board with every complaint, every stolen credit, and every intimidation tactic you've used. Brad's fingers twitched over the paper. He looked at Robert, then at Emma, searching for sympathy, but found none. The walls were closing in. He wasn't feared anymore. The room felt suffocating as he finally picked up the pen and signed. His signature, once a mark of authority, now symbolized his downfall. Robert took the document and stood. Effective immediately. You are no longer a manager at Falcon Tech. Brad exhaled sharply, his arrogance gone. As he walked out, employees outside the office glanced up, watching in stunned silence. For years, Brad had ruled over them. Now, he walked out as just another man. The tension in the office slowly lifted. For the first time, employees felt heard. Mia stepped into Robert's office later that day. I just wanted to say thank you. Robert nodded. This was never about just one person, Mia. It's about changing how things work here. Emma leaned against the doorway. So what's next? Robert smiled slightly. A company is only as strong as its people. We're going to rebuild trust, starting with leadership. That afternoon, a meeting was called. Employees gathered, still cautious but hopeful. Robert faced them, his voice steady. Falcon Tech is changing. Effective immediately, promotions will be based on merit, not favoritism. Concerns will be addressed, not ignored. This is your workplace. You deserve to thrive in it. A murmur of agreement swept through the room. For too long, they had accepted toxic leadership as normal. Now, they had a reason to believe in something better. As the meeting ended, Emma turned to Robert. This isn't just a policy shift, is it? Robert shook his head. It's a culture shift, and it's only the beginning. The changes at Falcon Tech didn't happen overnight, but the shift was undeniable. For the first time in years, employees felt heard. Emma worked closely with Robert to restructure leadership. Instead of rewarding arrogance, they promoted integrity. Employees like Mia, who had always worked hard but were overlooked, were given opportunities to step up, but not everyone welcomed the change. Some managers, used to the old ways, resisted. One afternoon, Robert overheard a hushed conversation in the break room. This whole respect and fairness thing is going to kill productivity. A senior supervisor grumbled. Yeah, another agreed. People work better when they're scared of losing their jobs. Robert wheeled into the room, his presence silencing them instantly. Tell me, he said calmly, do you really believe that fear is more effective than motivation? The two men exchanged nervous glances. We're just saying things were more efficient before. Robert folded his hands. Then let's measure efficiency differently. Let's measure it by employee satisfaction, by retention rates, by innovation. If you want to lead here, you lead with respect. Their faces paled. The era of fear-driven leadership was over. Months passed, and the transformation at Falcon Tech became evident. Productivity didn't drop, it soared. Employees who once dreaded coming to work now collaborated with excitement. Innovation thrived, not because of pressure, but because people felt valued. Susan and Brad were gone, but their absence wasn't mourned. In their place stood leaders who uplifted, not suppressed. Mia became head of employee relations, ensuring that no one would ever feel as invisible as she once had. One evening, as Robert prepared to leave, Emma knocked on his office door. You did it, she said. We did it, he corrected. She smiled. Falcon Tech feels like a real team now.